country. Currently, Ms. Call is the founder and CEO of Crystal Clear Communications, LLC, where she helps small to large businesses with defense contracts. She's one of the youngest directors at the Department of Defense as a GS-15, the highest civilian rank. She has worked for UN Women, Carnegie Endowment, RAND, and several other think tanks. She holds 12 policy fellowships and has in-country experience in 75 countries. She also speaks languages and has a PhD in progress at Brown University on violence in Kashmir. She is a champion of creating awareness about the genocide against Kashmiri Pandits. Thank you for being here.
Namaskar. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate Kona for putting this on, and I think that this is a really timely event. We're having a Hindu Advocacy Day, both in light of the attacks in Pahalgam and also with the recent release of the Bengal Files, which I had the pleasure of seeing this past Sunday with Director Vivek Agnihotri. And I hope many of you are staying for dinner as well, because it's really, it highlights the atrocities that occur, not just in Kashmir, not just in Bengal, but all around the world. And I think it's important that we advocate for our community, because we live in a country where all rights matter. And I think that oftentimes certain voices get hidden or get overshadowed simply because certain groups just don't advocate enough for themselves, which is something I really tried hard to do in my campaign. I tried to bring a voice to those who felt they never had one, bring light to causes which have gone swept under the rug. I grew up both a Kashmiri Pandit and also Punjabi Sikh. So I ran for Congress as the first ever Kashmiri Pandit ever to run, and also as the first ever Sikh woman to run. So you can imagine you get a lot of questions. It's always harder to break those class barriers. And I think that it's important to highlight causes that don't make limelight in the media. We hear a lot about Israel-Palestine, but you haven't really heard as much about Kashmir over the years. I've worked in the Department of Defense. I was a director there. I was in the highest civilian rank, and I can tell you that I would walk into rooms and give the first ever briefing on Kashmir to four-star generals, to some of our most senior leadership. I served under 2 secretaries of defense. And I think that it's because there's not enough advocacy that is done. So I want to highlight the need for Hindu rights. There's still vandalism that occurs against Muslims in this country. There's still racism that occurs. I faced racism myself. I grew up in Long Island, New York. People get surprised when they hear that, but I was called racial slurs throughout middle school and high school. And I say that even though Indian Americans in this country have risen to the highest levels, and even though we are the wealthiest minority in the country, it does not change the color of your skin. It does not change perception that occurs. So your kids are still vulnerable to it. You still are susceptible to discrimination. In my run, I heard of prominent Sikhs who said that we still get discriminated against in country clubs. I heard very prominent doctors and businessmen who came out and said we've been embarrassed to say it, but we face it. We face it at work. We face it in social events, and we don't want to talk about it because we think it may affect kind of our stature, the way people perceive us. But I think it is important, and that's why it's important to have that political outlet so that people can represent you and defend you and highlight causes that are happening both here in the U.S., but also back at home. If you are Bengali, I just watched the Bengal Files, and it was heartbreaking to see why nothing was done. Nothing was done by Delhi, nothing was done by the military, the police force, and the diaspora, frankly. And I think that in 2025, this can't continue. We have to come together as a community. We have the strength. We have both attained the wealth, attained academics, attained the success to be able to bring light to these causes. And I think it's important for organizations like Kona that you're doing this. So I appreciate it, and thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Such a pleasure having you with us. Thank you for the wonderful words, and it's an inspiration for our young people to look at public service from your example. Thanks again. We have the pleasure of Congressman Rich McCormick, who needs no introduction. He's been one of our champions from day one. So always a pleasure to have him join us for Advocacy Day. Busy schedule, lots of things going on today. So thank you, Congressman, for joining us. Please come up here.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today. Good luck to you in everything you do on your primary process and taking back our country for what things represent our society. The reason I'm here is not because it's convenient, that's for sure. I'm like literally going to votes in about 1 minute. It's not because I'm 2% Indian, which I am. It's not because my son's engaged to a woman who's of Indian descent, which he is. It's not because I'm the chair of the Hindu caucus, because I am. It's not because I agree with everything India is doing and that I've met with Prime Minister Modi and their economy is booming, they're strategically important to us, which all those things are true. It's because I'm your friend and because I was asked to come and because relationships matter. In everything we do going forward, you're going to find that people play partisan politics all the time. But careful what you believe and careful who's actually representing what you are significantly invested in. When you talk about the future of America, the future of our countries together, when you talk about relationships between our president, Prime Minister Modi, the futures of our countries, we build an economy based on a similar constitution. And what made that incredibly strong, what's given us 200 years of growth, cheap energy, employment, a work ethic, the things that are good for you mentally, physically, spiritually, all the things that we value together as a community. It doesn't matter if you're Hindu or Christian or whatever you are. We share those values. Those are universal to us the way we are created. And know that that family structure, when I go to your house and I have dinner, when I go to your temple, when I go to be with your family, when we are accepting each other as equals in this game of life, this great experiment of government, we're doing this together. And that's why I'm here, because I am your friend, I am your family, and together we will triumph. But let's keep working and know who your friends are. God bless you. Step forward.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I would now like to ask Professor Lee J. Jessam to join me at the podium. Professor Jessam is an American social psychologist. He leads the Social Perception Laboratory at Rutgers University. His research includes studying stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and political radicalization. Thank you so much.
So just a quick thing. I know some of you may be wondering why Congressman had to leave so fast without a picture opportunity. There's a vote going on, and he literally had 1 minute before the vote starts. So that's why he had to leave. He profusely apologized, because many of you know he's been a strong supporter of our community from day one. And this Advocacy Day wouldn't be possible without him. So I just wanted to clarify that because we never know what's going on in Congress. You know, we schedule these Advocacy Days, and then, for example, President Trump has called a special meeting today of many Republicans this evening, and then this vote is going on. So many things are happening, but this is the nature of where we are. So things are always going to be fluid. So just keep that in mind, and you never know who's going to be able to make it, not able to make it, till the very last minute. So that's just wanted to clarify that in case people are wondering. Thanks. So just click, yeah.
Oh, you're going to click?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm actually nervous, but okay.
You want to pull it up?
Will it reach out? Yeah, I would much rather, so that way I can sort of control the flow and stuff. But while I'm doing that, thank you for having me. This has been very interesting, and you know, the speakers have been terrific, albeit on some really horrible topics. This will be a little bit of a change of pace because I am a research psychologist. That means I do surveys and experiments on all sorts of things, including on things like stereotypes, prejudice, and intolerance. And actually, that's what this is. That's what this is going to be about. So there's going to be studies and sort of methods and even some light statistics. So I'll try and realize this is not an audience of methodologists, so I'll try to do this as clearly as we can. Okay, so you see the title there, Instructing Animosity. This research is on how DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion rhetoric around caste and race can actually create hostility and bigotry. This was done with the Network Contagion Research Institute. They're referred to by a couple of speakers. He's going to continue right along. Justice rhetoric that unjustifiably presume that certain kinds of discrimination is rampant, and then proceeds to demonize groups seen as perpetrators of oppression. And that rhetorical turn, I don't know if it began with Lenin, you can see Lenin's take on it, and I think tactically it certainly has those kind of roots. So this sort of demonization rhetoric is common certainly throughout academia and beyond. And so this is just an excerpt from White Fragility. White people raised from Muslim society and conditioned into a white supremacist worldview. Racism is the norm. Kendi, racism is essentially capitalist. Capitalism is racist. Well, capitalism is still racism. But it's not just these popularizers of various variations of anti-racism. Article from Nature, scientists from historically excluded groups face a hostile obstacle course. Books on just 10 zillion books on all sorts of bias and prejudice. It's not restricted to race, ethnicity, or religion. Science faculty subtle gender biases favor male students. Social privilege, which doesn't really obviously refer to prejudice, except that it refers to what others might call successful high status groups. What does privilege refer to? Privilege refers to unearned advantages. And what do you do with people who are privileged, that is, have unearned advantages? You strip them of those advantages because they don't deserve them, because they're privileged. And most relevant here, perhaps, although really relevant broadly, is the Equality Lab report from a few years ago on caste in the United States with, and this is a quote from the report, right? This includes, it goes on and on, caste oppressed immigrants, who then go on to endure multiplied systems of bias, including casteism, racism, and religious fundamentalism in the U.S. Okay, so there's that rhetoric of oppression and demonization. But the evidence on discrimination is actually complex and nuanced. And it doesn't really support any simplistic narrative. I'm going to give you some brief flavor of that. So none of the business is denying that discrimination occurs. I guess as many people in this room have experienced some level of discrimination, and nothing here says that it doesn't happen. However, it is the way it happens and when it happens, how frequently it happens, and to whom it happens is not consistent with these simplistic sort of demonization narratives. So this is a meta-analysis, this broad statistical review. I don't know if you can see, I just screenshotted the paper. At the bottom, it highlights the review. It's on race, class, and the criminal justice system. It's commonly believed ethnicity predicts criminal justice outcomes in the US. For most crimes, evidence for racial disparities is weak. This is a blog on my Substack. I blog at Unsafe Science. You're getting a taste for why it's called that. On the discrimination paradox. I don't know if you can see that. What that lays out is that there's a series of studies finding that acts of discrimination occur, but they occur at very low levels. These are mainly racial discrimination. And yet there's other research saying that experiences of discrimination are substantial. So these would seem to conflict. What I do in this blog post is point out that they don't conflict. Tiny, extraordinarily low levels of acts of discrimination can actually produce substantial experiences of discrimination, and that doesn't support any narrative. Because on the one hand, you have to admit that the acts of discrimination are exceedingly low, and yet the experiences are high. So there's no simplistic narrative here. So, okay, that's that. My paper was invited to a journal. It's now in press now. And then, in this famous case, Students for Fair Admissions, you have systemic racism against white and Asian students throughout college admissions. I mean, the particular case involved North Carolina and Harvard, but I'm an academic and I've been paying attention. This is throughout academia. It's all throughout it. And it's systemic what systemic racism refers to are institutional policies that discriminate. That's what this was. That's exactly what this was. Okay, so again, not consistent with any simplistic narrative, say, about white supremacy, for example. This is on sexism. This is another meta-analysis, this broad statistical compilation of lots of studies. Both scientists and lay people overestimate, this is from the abstract of the article, so I'm summarizing the main points. Both scientists and lay people overestimated the continuation of bias against female candidates in employment. Instead, selection bias in favor of male over female candidates was eliminated, and if anything, slightly reversed starting in 2009 for most jobs. National hiring experiments reveal a 2-to-1 preference for women in STEM hiring. Now, this doesn't negate the prior work showing biases against women. The point is that the evidence is nuanced and complex and contradictory and inconsistent with the kinds of narratives that you have often heard emerging from academia and elsewhere. Okay. But you clearly also have this sort of demonization rhetoric for groups, right? Academia or sometimes mass media. What our studies were designed to answer is this question: is how are people affected by this sort of rhetoric, this sort of demonization rhetoric? So the first study was on demonizing Hindus and Brahmins. I'm going to give you an overview of the study, then give you the details. So this was a national survey experiment. People from around the country participated. They were matched on US demographics to make it a more representative sample. The study had 3 parts, and I'll give the details in the parts in a minute. But the first part, people were randomly assigned to read one of 2 essays. Sort of a social justice DEI type essay on caste oppression, and a more even-handed historical essay on Jati, Varna, and caste. In the second part, they then read a very simple scenario involving a college application interview, and I'll explain why it will be obvious why in a minute. And then in the third part of the study, they answered questions that constituted the main outcomes. Okay. The real question is, are there differences in people's responses when they read the social justice DI essay versus the more historical neutral essay? Okay, so what were these essays? So this is an excerpt from a longer essay. We drew on the Equality Labs report. So the Equality Labs report is infamous. Probably some of you are familiar with it. If you don't, it's been this bizarre, from my standpoint as a psychologist concerned with methods and credibility and the validity of psychological and social psychological research, the impact that this report has had is jaw-dropping and completely undeserved. But that's the way it goes. The world works like that. So this essay was based on the rhetoric you can find in their report. Most of this is a direct quote. Occasionally, because we're excerpting from different places, we sort of paraphrase and add sort of connecting tissue. But you can read it. You don't need me to read it. It's huge $1 to caste oppressed. They've experienced all sorts of injustices, and okay, it's all about oppression. The more historical essay, again, I'll leave that up there for a minute. You can just read it. Jati and Varna on concepts for India, describe ways people might identify and interact, and so forth and so on. Doesn't deny the existence of caste. That's the end. And this is just an excerpt. There's much more there, but it's simply a more sort of even-handed, less denunciatory tail end of that history. Okay, so those are the two essays. Here's the scenario. This is the entire scenario. Everything in the scenario is here. Right? Raj Kumar applied to an elite East Coast university in fall 2022. During the application process, he was interviewed by the admissions officer, Ram Prakash. Ultimately, Raj's application was rejected. That is the entire scenario. We did counterbalance, that is, sometimes Raj was interviewed by Anand, sometimes Anand was interviewed by Raj, just in case people associated Raj and Anand with different things. Okay, and so here are the outcome variables. How biased and harmful was the admissions officer? Oh, I'll go back here for a second. There's no evidence of anything here. It was an interview. The guy was rejected from college. Like, people get rejected from elite colleges all the time. There's nothing going on here. There's nothing. Right? There was nothing going on. Okay, so just want to make sure that, you got that. Okay, so we asked them, how biased or harmful was the admissions officer? How willing are they to punish the admissions officer? And these slowly scaled up. So she should be required to apologize. There should be student protests. The DEI office should get involved, right? And up to and including firing. There were 10 of these questions. How racist are Hindus? And demonization of Brahmins via endorsement of, for lack of a better term, 3 repurposed Hitler quotes. So this is what we did. We went to Mein Kampf. We identified things that Hitler wrote about Jews, right? I mean, it doesn't, right? And then we repurposed them, just flipped out Jews and flipped in Hindus, right? The Jew was only and always a parasite in the body of other peoples, and so just that becomes the Hindu was only and always a parasite in the body of other peoples. And we use Hitler. I mean, Hitler's like peak demonization. Hitler's quotes are like the foundation for ethnic cleansing and genocide, right? Okay, which you've heard a fair amount about here already. Okay. It's not fuzzy on my screen here, but you can see that. Okay, so what you see here is the difference between the caste oppression essay and the Varna Jati essay. So for example, so this one, I don't know if you can see this in the back, how many microaggressions did the applicant experience? So people reported seeing 32% more microaggressions if they had the caste oppression essay. That's what this is showing. How biased is the admissions officer against lower caste Hindus? 20% more biased if they had the caste oppression essay than if they had the essay. And it goes on, how harmful, how biased, how unfair, just across the board. So the Equality Lab's caste oppression essay is having these sort of nasty effects on people. Okay, so we had all these questions on willingness to punish. We simply we averaged them all together. Again, they're more willing to punish the admissions officer when they had the caste oppression essay than when they had the sort of more even-handed historical essay. And they perceived Hindus as more racist when they had the caste oppression essay than when they had the more historical essay. And they are much more likely to say, yeah, Hitler. They're not saying Hitler, they don't realize they were Hitler. They are much more likely to agree with these repurposed Hitler quotes after getting the caste oppression essay. Okay. That's the caste oppression study. We also see how general this is. We looked at the effects of anti-racist rhetoric. So the structure was exactly the same. There were some minor differences, which I'll get to in different, right? We constructed 2 essays. there was an admission scenario, there were the questions assessing the main outcomes. This one, we did this with Rutgers intro psych students. So psychological research on the basis of college students sort of has a bad reputation because it is absolutely true that people in my field for decades would do research on college students and act like this generalized to all of humanity, which is really dumb. It was just really, really dumb, and it was completely unjustified. It took us 50 years to realize that as a field. We have realized that as a field, which might lead you to wonder, well, why the hell is he studying college students? And the reason is, we purposely did this with college students. First place, we had the other study with the national sample. But the type of anti-racist DEI rhetoric was all over colleges and universities for most of the last 7 or 8 years. Students would come in and part of orientation, they would be exposed to this sort of thing. So we absolutely want to see how this would affect college students, not to mention that they're young, they're potentially impressionable, may carry this on, whatever they learn for the rest of their lives. Okay, so we purposely did this. We're not making a claim about this generalizing to all of humanity. Okay, so once again, people read 2 essays. There's the DEI social justice essay based on excerpts from Robert DiAngelo and Ibn Kendi. I'll get to that in a minute. And then here we use a very different kind of control or comparison, a completely neutral one, having nothing to do with race or prejudice, on growing corn. Just a completely neutral essay. Okay, so we, much like we did with the Equality Labs report, we did the exact same thing, except we drew from 2 sources. We drew from Kendi and DiAngelo's, Kendi's had to be an anti-racist, DiAngelo's like fragility. We took text from that, we kind of smoothed it over a little bit, and we had again, it was about 180 word essay, so this is just an excerpt. And yeah, you just, this is just demonizing white people. Racism norms, unusual, and so forth and so on. And then corn was just about growing corn. I mean, there's just nothing. It's about growing corn. What else can you say about it? But also, this went on for a couple of hours. Okay. The scenario was nearly identical, but now there was no names. We didn't want to give 2 white names and 2 black names, so we gave no name at all. Student applied to an elite coast university. During the application process, was interviewed. Ultimately, the application was rejected. So we had, the outcomes were almost the same, not quite identical, very close. Same 6 questions about bias and harm. There were 2 additional questions about the race of the interviewer and the applicant. That didn't really turn out too much, although I'll show you those results. The same 10 questions about willingness to punish. So much like in the caste oppression essay, when they had the Kendi DiAngelo essay, they this is the whole scenario. This is right. This is nothing. Okay, there's nothing going on here. 35% more microaggressions, 25% more harm, right? 20% more bias, right? This is what they're seeing. They're kind of concocting bias and harm in the essay. I'm sorry, in the scenario, because they were kind of led to see the world that way by the essay. Okay, that's what's going on there. This is the punishment. This is here the same guy is broken out separately. So there's 16% more likely to demand a public apology, students should protest, there should be DI office investigation, and so forth and so on. We'll just leave that up for a minute. You can look at it, and have to talk about it at the annual, in general, whatever. So the DI rhetoric is leading to this sort of demonization stuff. Okay. So, bottom line, in both the national sample and the student sample, this sort of DEI, social justice rhetoric, caused people to see bias in interactions where none existed. There's no bias in this, like they saw it. And it increased their willingness to punish people for biases that they perceived that did not exist. In the first study, the caste oppression study, that's rhetoric, increased perceptions of Hindus as racists, and an increased demonization of Brahmins, as indicated by the endorsement of the Hitler courts. Now, a couple of caveats. My lab, I think, is the first lab in the country that is even studying the potential negative consequences of this sort of social justice rhetoric. I mean, throughout much of academia, this has been so widely embraced that the idea that it might have bad consequences is like not in the discourse. Never occurred to anybody that it might have these kind of nasty effects. So, but that does mean these are first or maybe among the first to study this, and you shouldn't really take the first studies finding anything with certain grains of salt, pending additional research by independent labs and so forth and so on. Also, we examined very specific types of DEI social justice rhetoric, based on the Equality Lab on the first study, based on Kendi and D'Angelo on the second. There's lots of other kinds of social justice rhetoric. There are lots of other DEI programs out there that maybe don't do this demonization thing. And so, you know, one shouldn't assume that this generalizes to like every DEI program or scholarship or pedagogy out there. It doesn't. It's very narrow and very specific. That doesn't mean it doesn't generalize, but you can't generalize from this to everything on the basis of the sort of narrow slice that we've done. And of course, we only examined caste oppression and anti-racist rhetoric. There's lots of other types of oppression rhetoric. You know, but the limitations actually raise questions. So how common is this type of demonization rhetoric throughout DEI interventions? It's very hard to answer that because most are not made publicly available. Actually, in the NCRI report, the green stuff at the very beginning, we did do an analysis of many that are publicly available, and they did, in fact, often have this kind of rhetoric. But that's just a handful that were publicly available. There's lots that's not publicly available, so who the hell knows what's going on in that stuff? Okay. Then does similarly, you know, inclusive in scare quotes, because it seems the opposite of inclusive to me. But anyway, does similarly inclusive demonization occur with respect to other groups based on religion or sexual orientation or really anything else? And then really a useful question to answer is what type of DEI interventions or trainings don't produce this demonization and really do produce the benevolent effects they promise? That'd be great to have an answer to that. The way DEI swept through academia and the corporate world, it was as if everyone knew exactly how to do it and what to do, even though there had been almost no research on the effectiveness of such programs. It was all by assumption and by ideology. And so, but that does raise the possibility, because there's been almost no research on the effectiveness of these DEI interventions, it raises the possibility that actually they could be done in a way that was constructive and benevolent. But we didn't find that, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. So, I think it should be done. How do they do that? Okay, so why should anybody care about any of this? So the I in DEI stands for inclusion, right? Inclusion, right? This is it's a multicultural society. There is prejudice, there is discrimination, there's intolerance. Most of us want to eliminate is probably never good. Right? Limit it, lead to a society that that is actually inclusive. I think most people want that. But if the effect of the rhetoric is to demonize and instruct animosity, it's producing the exact opposite of inclusion. It's producing exclusion and division. And that kind of animosity, rather than being a social good, is corrosive to the creation of a welcoming, multicultural society. Okay. I can take questions. Yeah.
Has anybody challenged this And what has been the response to this study from the so-called caste activists that may come after you for such a horrible research that you've done?
So they haven't come after us. They don't even know that they know about us. So the caste activists have not come after us. Let me put something back up here. Yeah, so in actually the social science of stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, there's been some weird critique. So, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. The weird critique is, well, it takes various forms. Isn't this just X? Where X is something we've known about for a long time. So one, isn't this just a framing effect? So framing effect is if you tell people to think about summers, they'll think about things having to do with summer. Right? If you tell them about winters, they'll think about it, right? So we're telling, right? These essays are telling, so this one, the Quality Labs is telling people to think about oppression so they see oppression. They were just told that, you know, oppression is everywhere, past oppression is horrible. So, right, that's just, isn't it just a framing effect? That was one. Two, isn't this just a priming effect? So priming is very similar, but not quite identical to a framing effect. But priming effect is if you get people to think about this. This is a very classic experiment. If you get people to think about the sun and the moon, right? So you can have them do the anagram S blank N, and they would fill in with sun, or you know M blank O, and then O and then you get to think about the sun and the moon, and you ask them to then name a detergent, they're more likely to say Tide. That's a priming effect, right? Because you've been thinking about the sun and the moon, it makes it easy to think about that. Okay. So it's like a framing, not exactly right. So isn't this just a priming effect? You have them thinking about oppression, so then they apply again, same thing. They're thinking about oppression. And then the third, isn't this just a demand characteristic? Demand characteristic is a little different. Demand characteristic is you run an experiment, and the participants, in our case the survey respondents, figure out what the experiment's about and simply give the researcher what they think the researcher wants to hear. So, you know, we're just getting there. They just read about oppression. Well, there's a researcher that cares about oppression, and I'm a good, cooperative, decent person, so I'm going to say yes, oppression, 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 oppression. Okay, so those are like the pushback, the scientific pushback. And I'm like, I don't know, we didn't, so those are all framing, priming, demand characteristics are all processes that could produce our results. And we didn't look at the process, so we don't know what process produced these results. So one, we can't empirically answer. On a practical level, I couldn't care less. It's like, if you think about how these things operate in the real world, if you're a college student being exposed to this as part of orientation, if it's a demand characteristic, right? Well, what is it? They're learning that at college you focus on oppression. Well, so you give people answers having to do with oppression. That would be the demand characteristic. So that may well be how this is working. If in both the framing and the priming explanations, if you lead people to think about oppression a lot, they're going to start seeing oppression everywhere. Well, okay, I'm not offended by that. That may well be what's going on. So that's why I described the criticism as weird. It may explain it, but it doesn't explain it away. Yeah, and then may well explain why it happened.
Yes, and I believe my DEI means like one group is less and the other group making superior, right? I'm asking as a question, you confirm. And the other thing is like, I watched some video on YouTube that says that DEI started on the 60s or something like that. You tell me the facts. You got the facts.
So
it's not new. DEI is not new, basically.
Can you repeat the question, please?
That's my question. If DEI is, if it's true that DEI started way after Martin Luther King, something like that.
Yeah. So your first point was about DEI inherently leading to oppressors and oppressed. That's true for the kind of rhetoric I study. I think there is, I think you can do DEI without oppressor-oppressed dichotomies. I think I'm pretty sure it's possible to have interventions that draw on, for example, people's common identities as Americans. And several of your speakers today have done exactly that. That the Hindu community in America are Americans and deserve to be integrated with and treated like and with the same rights as every other American. I mean, I've never seen a DEI intervention like that, but it's imaginable that such could exist. Okay, all right. So I don't think it's inherent to DEI, even though it is what I studied. And how old it is, it's the DEI interventions and trainings really started scaling up around 10 years ago. So diversity rhetoric has been around since the Baki-Scotus, the Supreme Court case in the late 70s that legalized the use of race in college admissions. But actually a close reading of that decision and the principles that led to that decision is really worthwhile. So in the Baki decision, the Supreme Court made it vividly clear that the reason that race could be considered, even though it's been overturned, it's been overturned by Students for Fair Admission, but for whatever, 45 years, it was the law of the land. So it was really interesting because diversity was not just race. There's quotes in there about how it could mean things like traveling widely or changing careers. And if you know of any colleges that, for example, provide an admissions benefit or fellowships based on having traveled widely, let me know, because I've never heard of it. So, and that's relevant because when it was talking about diversity, it was way not, it was talking, right? There's two kinds of diversity, right? The original meaning of the word diversity, if you look at old dictionaries, it means variety. So, variety of people. Variety is variety. It's not a particular kind of variety. But the second meaning, I believe, has been induced by the progressive movement within the US, that what diversity means is oppressed groups. And so what academia did is they marched through this loophole that the Supreme Court created in the 1978 Baki decision, which permitted diversity to be used to focus on racial affirmative action, which is not what that decision supported. So that's my long and historical and kind of complicated response to that question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us today and sharing your research with us. Next, I'd like to call up Congressman Andrew Clyde. He's serving as a representative for Georgia's 9th Congressional District and has been there since 2021. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Again, Congressman Clyde and I go way long time back. So, but again, he's so much under pressure. I had to force us to go against IRS. So he can tell the story.
Yeah, thank you, Rajiv. I appreciate that very much. It's one thing I believe in and have fought for continually and will continue to fight for. Both as a Navy officer, I spent 28 years in the United States Navy, including 3 combat tours overseas. It's freedom. Freedom. That's what it's all about. Freedom and liberty. We have our amazing Constitution, which I think is the most, is literally for a government, is the most amazing document in the entire world, because it guarantees freedom and liberty. And it guarantees that it's those who are governed that give the permission to the government. All right? I serve based on the people of the 9th District. They're the folks that say, we have chosen you to represent us. Okay? And if you screw up, we're going to change it. Okay? I mean, that's exactly what our government should be and what our nation is. And that's why it's so important. We all have religious liberty. And we have that because of our Constitution. Now, granted, it's a God-given right. All right? But our Constitution recognizes that in its First Amendment. And therefore, we have the freedom and the liberty to worship as we choose. And that is respected in this United States. Regardless of who you are, all right, or what you believe, that is what is so critically important, and that is what we fight for every day in this country. And honestly, that's why I believe this country is so prosperous, because we are free. Innovation is able to flourish, and you are also able to enjoy the fruits of your labor. However much you want to work, all right, however prosperous you want to be, you can be in this country. And that is what we have to preserve and protect. And so that's why it's an honor to serve the folks of the 9th District. It's an honor to serve the folks of Georgia. And it's an honor to be here. And thank you, Rajiv, or wherever you went. Where'd you go? There you are.
How are you?
And thank you for the invitation, for being here. And so I appreciate it. Thank you. Yes.
Can please just come up and we'll take a group picture with him real quick. We gotta go, so let's make it quick. Yeah, let's come up a little bit. Yeah, we can get more people. Yeah, whoever can squeeze in. Come. All right.